This upcoming offseason is going to be a very interesting one for the Chicago Bulls, and it really starts with the biggest decision going into the offseason, and that is of the contract extension for their star player in Zach Lavine, because outside of Lavine, the rest of their core players are all under contract going into next season. The only players who are on expiring deals and set to become free agents going into this offseason are Derrick Jones Jr., Troy Brown Jr., Matt Thomas, okay, and Tristan Thompson. Now, I'll talk about the rest of those expiring deals in a separate video when assessing who will be coming back and who won't be returning to the team going into the 2022-23 season, but spoiler alert, I don't think any of these remaining expiring deals will be in a Bulls uniform next season. Maybe Derrick Jones Jr. if it's on a favorable deal, but I don't see any of those guys getting re-signed. But anyway, it's no question that Zach Lavine is the only expiring contract with any sort of consequence for the franchise going forward. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about what Zach Lavine's options actually look like going into free agency, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions and confusions as to what he can actually get paid by the Bulls versus another team in the league. What are the Bulls' options as it relates to extending Zach? And then finally, what should the Bulls actually do based on these options? So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. And this is probably one of the biggest topics of the offseason for Bulls fans. And I really shouldn't even say this offseason. This has been one of the biggest topics / debates among Bulls fans for quite some time now, dating all the way back to last offseason, when there was the possibility for the Bulls to reach a contract extension agreement with Zach, but ultimately the sides were not able to agree. Then, of course, Zach signed with Clutch Sports, which drew more question marks that had Bulls fans going into a frenzy that Zach wasn't going to be in Chicago long term, which had no basis whatsoever given the fact that Lonzo Ball is a Clutch client, and they advocated for Lonzo coming to Chicago. And then throughout the season, when it started to become more and more clear that DeMar DeRozan was really more of the 1A option for the Bulls, when Zach was kind of more of that 1B option, that made Bulls fans question even more, is Zach Lavine really worth a max contract? Then the back half of the season, that escalated that debate even further when Zach's play started to dip after injuring his knee. And now that the offseason is here, we had Zach's exit interview in which he was asked questions about his impending free agency, which Zach was very cryptic and non-committal in his response, saying he was going to be approaching free agency with an open mind and looking at all possible options. So now you have fans freaking out saying, Zach's leaving, it's over. Well, I wouldn't really lead too much into those comments, because we all know how free agency works. It's all about establishing leverage and establishing for an agency like Clutch, who has a pretty tight grip on their clients, on not saying anything to the media that would give up some of that leverage when going into negotiations. So yes, it would have been nice for Zach to even say that his preference is to stay in Chicago, or even to say that Chicago is in the lead when it comes to his options, which you'd have to assume the Bulls are, because they can offer him way more money than any other team. But I get it. You want to keep the franchise guessing and let them know, hey, you're not the only option that I'm going to be looking at. Now, I've talked about this topic before, and generally speaking, it usually creates a lot of heated debates in the comments. So just remember to keep it respectful in the comments towards others and myself. This is just talking about sports after all, nothing serious. I'm also prefacing that because I'm going to be brutally honest in my view on where I stand with Zach Lavine and his contract extension, and it's probably not the most popular opinion. Now, let me start with what a contract extension would look like for Zach Lavine by the numbers. So as I mentioned, the Bulls have the ability to offer him the most money, more than any other team in the league, because the Bulls own his bird rights, which is a rule set by the league to allow for teams to have the advantage in retaining their star players and not just have said star players walk away to a bigger market or a better basketball situation when they become a free agent. It doesn't mean players don't leave for less money anyway. Sometimes that does happen, but generally speaking, players are going to be incentivized by a higher contract value. So for Zach Lavine, he's going to be eligible for a max contract extension to the tune of $212 million for 5 years. That's what the Bulls can offer him, and the Bulls only can offer him that much. That would average out to about $42.4 million per year over the 5 years, which could be broken out evenly, or over the course of 5 years, it could be front-loaded or back-loaded depending on how the contract is negotiated. Usually you see contract agreements back-loaded where players receive more of the money towards the end of the contract, with the salary going slightly up year after year. So that's the most the Bulls would be able to offer 5 years at $212 million while signing with a new team. The most Zach could obtain on a max contract is $157 million for 4 years, which comes out to about $39.2 million a year. And of course, it doesn't have that extra fifth year guaranteed. So in total, Between the max of what Zach would be able to receive from the Bulls versus any other team in the NBA, Zach would be leaving a guaranteed $55 million on the table to leave Chicago. I know a lot of pro athletes, for them, financially speaking, they are set for life, but $55 million is a lot of money to pass up on. I don't care who you are. Now, the question is, are the Bulls going to offer Zach that max contract of $212 million? Like, even though he is eligible, it doesn't mean the front office has to pay him that amount. And it's up to the front office to determine whether a player like Zach Lavine is worth that much. Now, in Arturas's exit interview to the media, when asking about Zach's free agency and whether they see him part of the organization long term, AK was pretty emphatic, saying that they see Zach being a big piece of this franchise and that they would like for him to be staying around long term. But of course, he did not commit on them being certain that they would be offering him max money, which they wouldn't do that. Like, even if this was Giannis we're talking about, the front office still isn't going to show their cards and say, yeah, we're going to be offering him a max contract extension before free agency even begins. So it's not a surprise. But here is the question that I think the front office really needs to answer. And it's pretty critical to the Bulls' future of this franchise. And it's a question I've talked about before, even all the way back to last season. And that's, is Zach that guy? Is Zach Lavine your number one option on a title contending team? Is he your franchise player and the guy that you should be building around? Because if you're offering him a max contract, that's what the expectation should be. You don't give a player a max contract to be a second or third option. Max contracts are designed for teams to use up to close to 30% of their salary cap on their best player. And if they can't say with confidence that Zach is that guy, then maybe a max contract isn't the way to go. Maybe it's something a little below the max. Because, look, I think we can all agree, whether you feel Zach is a max player or not, he's right up there in terms of elite scoring ability and athleticism. He's an all-star, and we can all agree he's underpaid relative to the contract he signed 4 years ago. Zach should be getting paid like some of the best players in the league. The other thing you have to consider, this is a 5-year commitment to Zach as your best player. To Lavine, taking up a good portion of your salary cap for the next 5 years. Lavine right now is 27 years old. If he were to sign that 5-year deal, he would be 32 by the time his contract ends, which we all know you can still be an elite player and in your prime at 32. DeMar DeRozan is 32 right now. But some players also decline rapidly by the time they hit 30, especially players who rely a lot on their athleticism, which Zach Lavine does. And then finally, the other piece you have to consider is whether this Bulls team, with their current core and roster construction, do they have enough to win a title? Because shelling out a max contract to Zach Lavine limits you in terms of your salary cap flexibility to add other pieces around the core, especially when you already have DeMar locked in for the next 2 years and Lonzo Ball for the next 3 years. Of course, Nikola Vucevic's contract is going to be expiring, which he's another player we have to talk about in a separate video because, again, he's going to be extension eligible this offseason along with Coby White, since they'll both be on expiring deals going into next offseason. But paying Zach over $40 million a year, which, mind you, that's in the range of players right now like Giannis, Kevin Durant, LeBron James, Damian Lillard, Steph Curry, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, James Harden. Like, these are superstar level players. That's a big investment and commitment for the future of this franchise, especially when you compare it to other players getting paid at that level. Now, I think you guys probably know where I'm going with this as it relates to my thoughts on what the Bulls should do with Zach's contract. And to be frank, I go back and forth on this a lot because on one hand, I don't see a scenario in which you can't not offer Zach the max, given you don't really have a ton in the way of alternatives. It's not like they're easily going to be able to replace a player of Zach's caliber, and letting Zach walk would be a step back, in my opinion. Like, even with DeMar, Lonzo, and Vucevic without Lavine, this Bulls team would be worse than they are right now. You're looking at maybe a fringe playoff team without Lavine at best. But on the other hand, and this is probably where I'm going to lose some subs and get some dislikes, and that's totally fine. But you guys know I'm always going to be keeping it honest on this channel and not just tell the viewers what they want to hear. But on the other hand, I don't think Zach Lavine is worth a max contract. I don't. I think he's pretty close to it. Like, I think paying Zach in the $30 to $35 million range is acceptable. I think with his play and being an all-star, that is more than justified. But giving him a max contract, max money, $42 million per year for 5 years, for a guy you can't even say was the Bulls' best player this past season and gone to one playoff series in his entire NBA career, like, he's going to be a guy leading this team to a title that you can build around. I really have a hard time seeing it. And look, if there was no salary cap in the NBA, I'd be like, whatever, pay Zach whatever he wants. It's not my money, and it has no bearing on the future of the franchise and how they construct their roster 2, 3, 4 years from now. But the fact of the matter is, the NBA has a salary cap, and paying Zach Lavine a max contract for 5 years has massive implications on the future of this franchise and what they're going to do, which as a fan, you take that into consideration. And look, I know some people will say, well, look at what some other guys around the league who are getting max contracts. Are they number one options? Not always anyway, and they probably weren't even close to a max contract when you look at their overall impact. Guys like Rudy Gobert, Bradley Beal, Kyrie Irving, Ben Simmons, hell, Russell Westbrook. Like, all these guys are on max contracts. Why can't Zach get one, especially when he's proven to be more impactful as a player than most of the guys that I just mentioned? Well, that's exactly my fear. Look at what happens when you max out some of these players who, while yes, are incredible basketball players, they're some of the best in the league, and at times they can be your number one option. But look where it's gotten them and their teams. Just because other players got max money at a similar skill level doesn't mean that's always going to be the best decision, because your hands are tied and that's the going market rate for these types of players. Like, I don't want the Bulls to make the same mistake like other teams have in being generous with their handling out of max contracts. And look, maybe Zach gets his knee fully healed to where it needs to be, which that's another concern, by the way, but I'll leave that alone for now. And maybe Zach continues to get better to where he becomes a superstar. And you say, oh yeah, paying Zach the max was absolutely worth it. Like, that very well could still be the case. I'm not going to sit here and say that Zach has peaked and that this is the best version of Zach Lavine we're going to see. But I, unlike a lot of Bulls fans, have a hard time seeing Zach advancing that much further unless he drastically improves his defense to become a more well-rounded two-way player and also improves his overall decision-making and IQ on the court. And if he was 23 or 24, I would say, well, he still has a lot of room to grow and learn, but Zach has been in the league for a while now. He's going into his 9th season, and I feel like we would have seen Zach taking that extra step to true superstardom by now. And again, I hope I'm wrong, especially if he's going to be wearing a Bulls uniform for the next 5 years. But if you've been watching basketball for as long as I have, you kind of get a sense of players and their true potential long-term and where they are starting to hit their ceiling. So in my view, I don't think Zach Lavine is worth a max contract. That being said, I do think ultimately he's likely going to get his max contract from the Bulls because they don't really have a ton of options, since letting Zach walk would actually be much worse than paying him the max. In an ideal world for me, I think offering Zach a contract of, say, 5 years, $175 million versus the max of $212 would be in the right price range for someone like Zach Lavine, and it would give the Bulls a little more added cap flexibility of around $7 million a year for some mid-level players. That would also still be more than any other team would be able to offer him, which would be the $157 million over 4 years. So it still gives the Bulls the upper hand in terms of Zach getting more money than he would be able to get somewhere else. He would still be leaving $25 million on the table if he felt that deal still wasn't good enough at $175 million. He would still be getting paid close to max money and still would be able to stay with the Chicago Bulls, a team and city he has said multiple times that he really values and has a strong bond and relationship with the coaching staff and front office. Do I think that this scenario I just laid out is likely? Probably not, because again, I think the front office is going to give him the max contract as a sign of appreciation and also not wanting to run the risk of tarnishing the relationship they have with Zach by offering him less money than he was looking for, but knowing that he's going to have to accept it because it's still more money than he would otherwise get from any other team. Honestly, the more I think about it, the Bulls have a ton of leverage with this contract extension, unless, of course, Lavine has his heart set on another location and isn't focused on the money at all, which I find unlikely. But if that is the case, the Bulls are kind of screwed either way. Anyway, so I wouldn't consider myself an anti-maxer, which I love that term, by the way. I first heard it from Matt Peck on Twitter, and he said he couldn't take credit for that, so I believe it was Mark K who might have coined the term. And I love those guys. I've had them on the channel in the past. They're great, so they're probably not going to like this video and my stance on Zach Lavine's free agency if they happen to catch this video. But I'm not an anti-maxer. I guess I'm more of an anti-max mandate. Jesus, did I really just say that and pull a Kyrie Irving? Gross. But no, what I mean is I'm not necessarily against Zach Lavine getting the max. I'm more against the notion of it being a foregone conclusion and requirement of the front office that they must give Zach Lavine a max contract just because that's what the market dictates. He's an all-star, and that is the going rate for an all-star. I think there are way more factors to consider. I think it has to be more strategic in nature when looking at the future of the franchise and trying to bring a title back to Chicago, because the last thing you want to do is run into a situation like a Bradley Beal, a great player, an elite scorer, a guy who kept getting better and better with every season, a multiple All-Star, was rewarded with a max contract, and look where it's gotten the Wizards over the years. Of course, some of that is on building the roster around him, which let's hope the Bulls would do a better job at that over the next 5 years. But for me, creating a little more cap flexibility by offering LaVine slightly lower than the max gives you a little insurance should things start to not pan out, if LaVine ends up not being that guy, that number one option on a title contending team. It makes the contract potentially a little more tradable as well down the line if things go really sour. So it doesn't turn into a Russell Westbrook or John Wall type scenario. I'm not saying that LaVine would ever get to that level, but you don't want it to turn into a contract that is virtually untradeable further down the line. Those are my thoughts on the matter. I am very curious to hear what you guys think, as I'm sure this is going to be a very heated debate. So let me know in the comments. And again, as always, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.